In the heart of St. Alden's General Hospital, where the scent of antiseptic lingered in the air and the distant hum of machines created a constant background noise, Dr. Michael Carter strode through the hallways like a man on a mission. At 45, he was one of the most respected surgeons in the city, a man whose hands had saved countless lives. Cold, methodical, and brutally honest, Michael wasn't exactly loved by his colleagues, but they couldn't deny his brilliance. To him, medicine was simple. Fix the problem, move on. Emotions were for the weak. Patient in room 304, his assistant Claire called out as she handed him a chart. Appendectomy, minor case. Michael barely glanced at the chart. Routine, prep for surgery. Let's get this over with before lunch. As he pushed through the double doors toward the operating room, Michael couldn't have known that today would be anything but routine. The patient waiting for him was a man named Thomas Reed, a 42-year-old school teacher who had come in with severe abdominal pain. But none of that mattered to Michael. Another incision, another fix, another name on a chart. Except, as fate would have it, the moment he stepped into the OR, something felt off. Before we dive, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. And while you're here, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe so you never miss a story that will leave you speechless. Now, let's get into it. The sharp scent of anesthesia filled the room, and the overhead lights glared down with an almost blinding intensity. Michael scrubbed in as usual, but as the mask settled over his face, the room swirled. The world shifted in a way that didn't make sense. And then, darkness. When Michael opened his eyes, he wasn't standing. He wasn't holding a scalpel. He wasn't even in control. Instead, he was staring up at the ceiling, flat on his back, disoriented, confused. Dr. Carter, can you hear me? A woman's voice, kind, familiar. He tried to sit up, but his body felt heavy, weak, like it wasn't entirely his own. What the hell is going on? He croaked. Claire appeared above him wearing scrubs and a surgical cap, but instead of handing him a chart, she was checking his IV. Just relax, she said softly. The surgery went well. You're in recovery. Surgery? Recovery? What surgery? Michael asked, his heart beginning to race. Claire glanced at him, puzzled. Your appendectomy, of course. Michael froze. Appendectomy? That was Thomas Reed's surgery. But as he looked down, he saw the hospital bracelet on his wrist. The name printed there sent chills down his spine. Michael Carter. He wasn't the surgeon anymore. He was the patient. The realization hit him like a freight train. Somehow, impossibly, their roles had been reversed. Hours passed, maybe days. Time blurred together as Michael lay confined to the hospital bed. Machines beeped rhythmically beside him, and nurses came and went, checking vitals, adjusting fluids. And for the first time in his entire career, Michael was forced to experience what it felt like to be on the other side. The first thing he noticed was how invisible patients felt. Doctors entered the room, discussed his condition as though he weren't even there, using terms too complex for him to fully grasp. He's stable, one said. We'll monitor overnight. Nothing to worry about. They left before he could ask a single question. The nights were worse. The constant interruptions, the fluorescent lights, the ache in his side where the incision was healing, the cold food trays and the lonely silence when visiting hours ended. And the pain. God, the pain. It wasn't excruciating, but it was constant, nagging, and no one seemed in a hurry to relieve it. For years, he had dismissed his patients' complaints about post-op discomfort. Now he understood. But it wasn't just the physical pain. It was the vulnerability, the fear of the unknown, the complete surrender of control. Lying there, staring at the ceiling, Michael thought about all the times he had brushed off a patient's anxiety with a curt, "You'll be fine." He thought about the times he hadn't explained procedures clearly, or when he had left a room too quickly because another case seemed more urgent. He thought about Thomas Reed, the man who, as far as anyone else knew, was now probably walking around in Michael's body, performing surgeries like nothing had happened. But when Claire returned to check on him again, Michael couldn't help but ask, "How's Thomas?" She looked confused. "Thomas? You mean the school teacher? He's recovering fine. Different floor." So Thomas was still Thomas. This wasn't some freaky body swap, just a cruel twist of fate, or maybe a lesson. As the days stretched on, Michael watched his colleagues work. He watched Dr. Patel breeze into his room, scanning his chart like it was an annoying formality. He watched Nurse Ellen administer his medications with robotic efficiency, never once looking him in the eyes. He heard the jokes they made just outside his door, as though patients couldn't hear through the thin walls. And slowly, resentment built inside him. How many times had he been just like them? When discharge day finally came, Michael's legs felt weak as he stood for the first time. Claire walked him to the front entrance. "Take it easy, doctor," she said with a smile. Doctor. The word felt strange now. Back at home, he looked at the stack of medical journals on his kitchen table and shoved them aside. For the first time in decades, he realized he didn't know everything. And maybe, just maybe, he never really had. The next morning, Michael returned to St. Albans. Not as a patient, not as the same surgeon either. Something inside him had shifted. During his first operation back, he looked down at the woman lying unconscious on the table and felt a surge of empathy he hadn't known he was capable of. "Let's make this as painless as possible," he told his team, and he meant it. In the weeks that followed, Michael became someone new. He spent more time explaining procedures. He listened. He asked patients how they felt and actually cared about the answer. Word spread quickly through the hospital. Dr. Carter wasn't the same anymore. Some called it a midlife crisis. Others whispered about burnout. But Michael knew the truth. He had lived on the other side. And once you've been the patient, you're never the same again. But the transformation wasn't without resistance. Not everyone welcomed the new Dr. Carter. During his first week back, Michael noticed the side glances from his colleagues. Whispers trailed behind him in the hallway. People who once admired his cold efficiency now questioned his sudden change in demeanor. "What's with Carter?" Dr. Patel muttered to another surgeon. "He's spending 20 minutes just talking to patients before surgeries now. We don't have time for this hand-holding." It stung more than Michael expected. He'd never cared about opinions before. But now, hearing them dismiss what he had learned firsthand, it lit something inside him. A quiet fury. They didn't understand. They hadn't lived it. One night, about 2 weeks after his discharge, Michael found himself called in for an emergency. A teenage girl had been brought in after a car accident. Broken ribs, internal bleeding, a collapsed lung. As he scrubbed in, the weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. The girl's name was Emily Parker, 16 years old, brown hair, blue eyes, terrified. Before the anesthesia took hold, Emily grabbed his hand. "Please," she whispered, "promise you'll wake me up." Michael felt his throat tighten. He thought of the nights in his own hospital bed, when no one had offered him comfort, when no one had promised him anything. "I promise," he told her. And for the first time in years, that promise wasn't just something he said to calm a patient. He meant it with everything he had. The surgery was brutal. More than once, they nearly lost her. Blood pooled faster than they could suction it. Vitals dipped dangerously low. But Michael refused to let go of the promise he'd made. After nearly 5 grueling hours, they stabilized her. As they wheeled her into recovery, Michael stood beside her, waiting, watching her chest rise and fall with the help of the ventilator. He didn't leave until she opened her eyes the next morning, and when she did, weak and hoarse, the first words she said were, "You kept your promise." It nearly broke him. But while he found himself growing closer to his patients, he grew more distant from his peers. The other doctors thought he was slipping, becoming too emotional, as Dr. Patel phrased it during one of their passive-aggressive staff meetings. "Your bedside manner is admirable," Patel said with a forced smile. "But let's not forget we're running a hospital, not a therapy retreat." Michael didn't respond, not in that moment. But later that evening, as he reviewed charts in his office, Claire knocked and entered. "You're different," she said quietly. Michael looked up. "Is that a bad thing?" She hesitated. "Not at all, but people are noticing, and not everyone likes change." Michael leaned back in his chair. "I used to think patients were just cases, just names on charts. But lying in that bed, hearing them talk about me like I wasn't even there, feeling how vulnerable you are when you can't do anything for yourself, it changes you." Claire nodded. Some of us already knew that. And for the first time, Michael realized Claire had always been one of the good ones, the kind of caregiver who treated people, not conditions. But just as Michael was finding his new rhythm, fate decided to push him even harder. 3 weeks after Emily's surgery, Thomas Reed, the very patient whose appendectomy he'd been preparing to perform before his own collapse, was back. But this time it wasn't for something routine. Thomas had been diagnosed with late-stage pancreatic cancer. Michael reviewed the scans himself, hoping for some mistake, some sliver of hope. But the evidence was clear. Stage 4, inoperable. Months left of that. Thomas sat quietly in the exam room as Michael explained the diagnosis. The man's face was calm, almost eerily so. "I guess it's my turn to lie in the bed for real," Thomas said with a faint smile. Michael struggled for words. What do you say to someone who already knows the ending to their story? But Thomas surprised him. You know, Thomas continued, when I woke up from my appendectomy, I remember hearing you were the surgeon. I didn't know much about you, but the nurses, they didn't exactly describe you as warm and fuzzy. Michael couldn't help but chuckle bitterly. They wouldn't have been wrong. But then during recovery, I heard something had happened to you. Something strange. People said you came back different, better. Michael nodded slowly. I had a chance to see things from your side. Thomas met his gaze. And that's exactly why I want you on my case, even if you can't save me. It was the first time in years Michael felt truly trusted, not just as a surgeon, but as a human being. Over the next few months, Michael visited Thomas nearly every day. Not as a doctor, but as a friend. He brought him books. They watched sports together in the lounge. They talked about life, regrets, and what it felt like to be on the edge of the end. Thomas's condition declined, as everyone knew it would. But on his last night, as Michael sat beside him, Thomas whispered, you know, you're more than just a surgeon now. Michael squeezed his hand. Thanks to you. After Thomas passed, Michael attended the funeral, something he never used to do. In the eulogy, Thomas's wife mentioned how her husband had found peace in those final months, thanks to the care of someone who had truly understood him. It wasn't long after that the hospital administration called Michael into a meeting. We've noticed the feedback from your patients, they said. It's extraordinary. Whatever you're doing, keep doing it. And we'd like you to lead a new program focused on patient-centered care. Michael accepted, not because he needed the recognition, but because he knew it was the right thing, because too many doctors were like he once was, brilliant but blind. Months turned into years, and the story of the surgeon who became the patient, only to return as a better man, became something of a legend in St. Albans. New interns would whisper about it during rounds. Nurses would smile knowingly whenever Michael took extra time with someone scared before surgery. And late at night, when the halls were quiet, Michael would sometimes pause outside room 304, the place where everything had changed, and remember what it felt like to lie helpless in that bed. It kept him grounded. It kept him human. Because in the end, Michael Carter learned that the greatest surgery he ever performed wasn't in an operating room. It was the one he performed on himself. And the scar it left behind, it wasn't visible, but it was the one that saved his soul. And that's where our story ends. A journey that reminds us how true change often begins when we experience life from the other side. If this story moved you or made you reflect, don't forget to support the channel by hitting that subscribe button. Your support helps us keep sharing powerful stories just like this one. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.